All right, well, let's turn in our Bibles to Galatians chapter 4. Our reading today will be verses 21 through 31. If you're using a pew Bible, this can be found on page 974. And let's hear God's word together in Galatians chapter 4, verses 21 through 31. The Word of God says this, "Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it's written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, 'Rejoice, O barren one, who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband.' Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. But just as at that time, he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also it is now. But what does the Scripture say? 'Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman.'" This is God's word. Let's receive it as such, and let's pray His blessing over it. Would you bow your heads with me? Oh Lord, we are indeed so weak in our flesh. There is nothing that we can produce that is good in us. There is nothing that we can conjure up by our own ability that is worthy. But Lord, that truth should actually bring us hope, because even though we are not worthy, we know one who is, and that is Jesus, the pure and spotless Lamb. He is the worthy one, who is worthy to open the seals, who is worthy of all praise and honor. And so we come delighting in Jesus this morning. We come in our weakness, we come in our failures, we come in our sin, and we lay it before Jesus, who is more than enough. And in Him we have our salvation, in Him we have our sustenance, and in Him we have our sonship. We ask that He would be glorified this time as we learn of Him through your word. I ask all this in the mighty name of Christ. Amen. There's an old famous story that you're probably familiar with called The Man in the Iron Mask. The Man in the Iron Mask is most famously known as it was written by Alexander Dumas. He was a French author who wrote the Three Musketeers series. And The Man in the Iron Mask was actually the final installment in the Three Musketeers saga. But The Man in the Iron Mask was actually based on sort of a myth. Actually, it was a historical fact that people had a lot of mythical speculation on in France. You see, there was a prisoner under the reign of King Louis XIV who actually was imprisoned for 34 years, had no name attached to him. He was this anonymous prisoner who was kept with his face wrapped up for 34 years. Nobody was allowed to talk about him. Nobody was allowed to know who he was. And so there was a lot of speculation about who is this mysterious man held prisoner in the mask. One of the popular theories that began circulating was that it was King Louis's secret brother, and that there was a power struggle between them, and that in order to make sure he alone had the throne, Louis had his usurper-threatening brother bound with this mask and kept under shackle for 34 years. And in the story of The Man in the Iron Mask by Alexander Dumas, it involves this whole plot where the secret brother is freed and tries to take over the throne of France and tries to put Louis in the Iron Mask. And so it's this conspiracy amongst these 2 brothers vying for power. And there have been many film adaptations made over the years, and a lot of speculation from historians about who was the man in the Iron Mask. But in the popular literary version of the story, at the heart of the story is this whole idea of there's 2 sons, and only one can be heir to the throne. 2 sons. One of them will be the king of France, while the other will end up a prisoner, will end up little more than a slave. That story is interesting because a similar type of dynamic is actually at the heart of today's passage as well. Here we read Paul reminding us that in the story of Genesis, Abraham had 2 sons, Ishmael and Isaac. Ishmael was conceived by the slave woman Hagar, whereas Isaac was the product of Abraham's marriage with his wife Sarah. But there was an even bigger difference between these two sons. Ishmael was the product of Abraham trying to take matters into his own hands and by his own fleshly ability producing a son of promise for himself. Whereas Isaac was a miracle child who came by the gracious work of God in this older couple who everyone thought was long past barren. And so at first, Ishmael looks like he's the older brother, looks like he would be the heir of all the promises given to Abraham. But surprise, it's actually Isaac, the younger miracle brother. And so at the heart of this story is this tale of two sons. And what Paul's going to do is he's going to take this story from Genesis of these two sons and he's going to apply it to the situation today about how there's two ways of trying to have standing with God. Through the works of our flesh, just like when Abraham tried to use the ability of his flesh to create Ishmael, or by receiving God's promises as a gift, that which he's given through the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is similar to how Abraham received Isaac, the son of blessing, by God's supernatural work. And it ends up being Isaac, the son of promise, the son who is the work of the Spirit, not the work of the flesh, who ends up being the heir of all that God has promised. And so we're going to be challenged today, what kind of son are you? Are you trying to earn sonship with God through the works of the flesh? Or do you receive sonship as a gift by God's promise through the work of the Spirit accomplished in the gospel of Jesus Christ? So several things we're going to look at today. First thing is this. We can go ahead and just pull up the introductory slide. I want to draw our attention to verse 22. Abraham had two sons. That's where the title of the sermon comes from. This tale of two sons. Abraham had two sons. Now, what Paul does here is he starts off by reminding people of the story of Abraham. And he says something curious in verse 21. He says, "You desire to be under the law. Do you not listen to the law?" If you remember, these Judaizers who had come into Galatia, they were trying to lead the Galatian Christians astray with this idea that it's not enough to just have faith in Jesus. You've now got to obey all the commandments of the Mosaic law as well. And Paul is really trying to save the Galatians from falling into legalism. And so he asked them here, hey, you want to follow the law? Don't you read what the law actually says? Now, there's two ways you could use the term law. Law could just be referring to the commandments that are given in the first 5 books of the Bible. But sometimes law is used in a very general way to refer to those first 5 books. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. Genesis is the first book, and it doesn't have any actual commands in it, but it's still considered part of the law, the 5 writings of Moses. And so Paul is saying, hey, you want to be saved by the commands of the law? Don't you read the law, all 5 books? Don't you remember what we see in Genesis? Remember, Paul over and over again portrays himself as the conservative, because it was the Judaizers who were saying, Paul is introducing these radical new ideas about Jesus and grace. We're just going back to the law. And Paul says, I'm going back even farther than you. I'm going back to Abraham, who preceded the law by 430 years. So you want to follow the law? Don't you read what the law itself says in the book of Genesis? Don't you remember the story of Abraham? And so he recaps here for them, and they would have known this story very, very well. Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman, one by a free woman. If you were here when we did our journey through the book of Genesis, you'll probably remember this. In Genesis chapter 12, we read about how God called this 75-year-old man named Abraham. And he said, Abraham, leave your homeland, go to the land I will show you. Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and through your offspring, all the nations of the world will be blessed. So God promises Abraham offspring, and then through Abraham's children, there would come worldwide blessing. And we talked about how that was ultimately a prophecy of the Messiah. The Messiah would come through Abraham's line and would mediate God's blessings to the world. Sounds great. The problem is Abraham is 75 and his wife Sarah are 65, and they've never had any children. Now at this point, when God first gives the promise, they think it's perhaps possible. At this point in the story, there's actually very good reason to believe that Sarah hadn't gone through menopause yet. So there's still a possibility. She's been barren, for 65 years, but there's still a chance. I remember a couple years ago, there was a story in China about a 67-year-old woman. Her and her 68-year-old husband conceived naturally. There was no IVF or anything like that. It was done totally naturally. Sometimes those things get delayed. It's certainly possible. So maybe Abraham and Sarah are thinking, it's not likely, but I guess biologically it could still happen. Flash forward a couple of years. Genesis chapter 15. Nothing's happened. There's been no pregnancy. There haven't even been any failed pregnancies. There haven't even been any miscarriages to maybe give the hope that, okay, it could be possible. There's been nothing. And so by Genesis 15, Abraham begin twiddling his thumbs and saying, God, you promised me an offspring, but I still don't have any. By the time I die, everything I have, my heir is going to be Eleazar, my household servant. It won't be a son of my body. And so God reassures him, no, I didn't forget about my promise. Look at the stars. Can you count them? No, you can't. Your offspring is going to be like the stars in the sky. And then God solidifies his promise with a covenant ceremony. We talked about how Abraham cut the pieces and God himself passed through the pieces, saying, Abraham, if I break my covenant, may I be like these sliced and diced pieces on either side here. God binds himself to his promise with a covenant. But then you come to Genesis 16. Abraham is now 85 or 86 years old, and Sarah is pushing 75 or 76. And by this point, even though they have God's promises and covenants, they seem to have given up hope. And so Sarah actually comes up with this idea that was culturally acceptable at the time. It still defied God's creation plan for marriage, but a lot of people were doing it, and Sarah thought it sounded like a good idea. What they would do is if the wife couldn't have a child, she would take one of her servants or one of her slaves, and the husband would impregnate the slave. The slave would be a surrogate mother, and then the child that resulted from that union would legally be considered the wife's. So the husband and the maidservant would reproduce together, but the child would sort of be considered the wife. So Sarah says, hey, God's not acting. We've got to take matters into our own hands. We've got to do something. We've got to act. We've got to use our ingenuity. And Abraham, no offense, man, but you're getting up there. I don't know how much longer you'll be capable of reproducing. I clearly can't anymore. You're pushing it. So we need to take advantage of things while we can and have you impregnate my maidservant. And so they did. And so Abraham impregnated Hagar, Sarah's maidservant, and they had a son named Ishmael. Now, what was significant about this is that the conception of Ishmael happened just the good old-fashioned way. Abraham's body was still capable of producing. Hagar was young. Her body was capable of producing. When you mix certain ingredients together, nature just has certain things happen. And so this baby Ishmael came about the good old-fashioned way. Nothing terribly supernatural about it. I mean, they say every baby's a miracle, and that's true. I just saw that this week. Life is an amazing thing. But there's a sense in which God has designed creation to work a certain way. And so there wasn't any direct intervention needed in order for Ishmael to come about. He was the work of the flesh, you might say. Flesh, we sometimes think, oh, that means sin. Not always. Flesh usually means one of two things. Flesh can either refer to something sinful, but sometimes flesh in the Bible just refers to human bodies and human strength. Right? We read in John that the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. It's not saying Jesus became sinful. It's saying Jesus took on a human nature, a human body. Jesus in the incarnation had human limitations. So the flesh often refers to just the human body, human strength, human limitations. So Ishmael was the product of human flesh, strength, and ability. It happened naturally. Flash forward 14 years. We come to Genesis 17 and 18. Abraham is now pushing 100. Sarah is now pushing 90. Ishmael's a teenager. He's 14 years old at this time. And there's been this decade-and-a-half assumption that Ishmael is the son of promise, right? God didn't act. Thank goodness we intervened. Thank goodness we used our own strength and our ability, and we've been able to produce this heir that God promised. Well, in Genesis 17 and 18, God pays a little visit to Abraham, and he tells him something shocking. He says, nope, Ishmael is not the son I had in mind. It is not through Ishmael that your line will come. It is not through Ishmael that the Messiah will come. That is still going to be a son of Sarah. And by this point, when Abraham hears it, he laughs. And then when Sarah hears it, she laughs too. That's what the name Isaac means. It means laughter, because they both laughed at God for saying this. And we read in Genesis 18, there was actually 3 different reasons why Sarah laughed at this. 3 different reasons why this was so impossible. Absurd that a son could come from Sarah. The first is that Sarah had been barren for a lifetime. Even when she was in her prime years, Sarah hadn't been able to conceive. So she's got a lifetime of barrenness. Secondly, though, Genesis 18:11 says it's a nice sort of sanitized PG version of saying It says, the way of women had ceased with Sarah. It means that not only was she barren in her fertile years, but now she's postmenopause. Her body can't even conceive anymore. But then there's a third hindrance as well. Genesis 18:12, Sarah says, I am worn out and my Lord is old. It's kind of a nice way of saying, Abraham's a little sterile at this point. So maybe their relationship isn't quite what it was. Abraham's 100. He's getting up there. And so Sarah's barren for a lifetime. She's past the age of childbearing, and Abraham's to the point where I'm not even sure things work the way they used to. So it seems utterly impossible. And then God says in Genesis 18:14, is anything too hard for the Lord? And sure enough, Sarah does conceive and gives birth to this son, Isaac. How? Well, it didn't happen because of human strength like in Ishmael's case. In Ishmael's case, it was human physicality and ability that resulted in this baby. But not in Isaac's case. In Isaac's case, all of the necessary human pieces required to make a baby were not operating as they should. This baby came about because of the gracious work of God and God alone. It was God keeping His promise. It was the power of the Holy Spirit at work. In Isaac's case, you needed more than human virility. Neither Abraham nor Sarah had the ability within their flesh to conceive. Something more was needed. Something supernatural was needed. And so Paul hearkens back to this story, and he says in verse 24 that this may be interpreted allegorically. Now, what does he mean by that? Sometimes when we hear allegorically, we think that means, well, this isn't really a historical account. It's just sort of like a Grimm's fairy tale. It's an allegory designed to make a point. Paul is not saying this never happened. He's saying, look at how God worked in this situation. Look at how God functions here. And now apply that to the current debate about salvation. Right? He's not saying that this story, so we could kind of compare it to like when we read the story of Moses and the Red Sea, and we see God opening up the Red Sea and God's people passing through. We don't read that and we don't say, this story is simply an allegory that's about me going through hard times. What we do is we say this is a historical account of how God intervened to save His people. And the same God who intervened to save His people then is the same God who saves His people now. So whatever I'm going through now, it's the same God at work. And so Paul takes that principle here and says, how did God work in the story of Ishmael and Isaac? It wasn't the product of human strength or ability, was it? It was the gracious intervening work of God that produced the offspring. And he says the same principle is true here. Here's the principle that's established. The one produced of the flesh, Ishmael, who was the product of the physical abilities of man, ends up the son of a slave woman in slavery. He's not the heir. But the one born through promise, the one born by God's supernatural work apart from man's contribution, he's the son of the free woman, and he is the heir. Paul says we clearly see that's how God operated in Abraham's story. Now let's apply it to the current debate about whether someone can be made right with God by the law, again, by the works of their flesh. Can someone be made right with God by the works of their own flesh and ability, or is it only by His grace? Paul says it's the same God at work. Let's apply those principles. So now what he's going to do is he's going to provide five contrasts. Five contrasts between Hagar and Ishmael on one hand and Sarah and Isaac on the other. And he's going to use this as sort of an allegory. He's going to use it as sort of an illustration, if you might will. You know what? When I'm up here, I might use a story to illustrate a point. That's what Paul's going to do now through the story of Hagar and Sarah. So let's look at the first comparison that's made. Comparison number one, human flesh versus God's promise. He says this in verse 23. He says, the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Ishmael was the son of the flesh. He was the one that Abraham could point to and say, I did that. Remember, Abraham was still capable of physically reproducing. But the son of the promise, the son of the Spirit, as verse 29 puts it, Abraham could only point to Isaac and say, God did that. Ishmael, Abraham could take pride in. Yeah, that's the strength of my manhood right there. But Isaac, Abraham could only say, I couldn't do that. That was all God. My wife and I had no ability to bodily reproduce. It was all God. And so the story of Ishmael and Isaac demonstrates this principle we just discussed. The son of the flesh, of human effort and virility, is not the one with the blessing. The son of human effort is not the one with the blessing. Rather, it's the Son of God's promise, the one who is the gracious work of God's Spirit. He is the one with the blessing. So Paul takes this principle of the story and applies it to the current discussion and says, God works the same way. And so this contrast between flesh and promise is the contrast between what human ability can accomplish and what God can accomplish. It's between being simply a biological offspring of Abraham and inheriting the promises of God by the power of God. Because here's another point that's being drawn here. The Judaizers took all this pride in the fact that, well, we're Abraham's offspring, right? We're descendants of Abraham's blood is surging through our veins. That makes us the recipients of God's promise. And Paul says here, well, yeah, well, so is Ishmael. Ishmael was just as much Abraham's son as Isaac was. Ishmael had Abraham's blood just as much as Isaac. Just being a biological son of Abraham isn't going to do it, because if that was the case, Ishmael would have been the son of promise. So it's not about whose blood is in your veins. It's about that Isaac was the son of promise who was enabled by the Spirit of God. That's what counts. The criteria is not whose blood is in your veins, but the grace of God. And so what Paul's saying here is, you Judaizers, you love looking to the law and the commandments there to promote this idea that people can be children of God by the flesh alone, either by the work of your flesh or by your fleshly descent from Abraham. He says, but reread the law you treasure so dearly. See how God works there. What principles do you see on display? How does God deal? It wasn't just the physical offspring of Abraham alone who received the inheritance. Otherwise, Ishmael would have been included. But the offspring that God himself provided by his own promise and by his own power. Abraham couldn't secure an heir by his own efforts, could he? God had to provide one. Ishmael was the result of Abraham trying to produce an heir by his own efforts. Paul says it's the same way when you try to earn justification by your efforts. When you try to keep the law in order to win God's favor and win God's blessing, it's the same as Abraham impregnating Hagar. You are acting just like Abraham in Genesis 16 when you do that. You need the supernatural work of God to produce a new birth in you. That's how you get Isaac. That's how you are the son of the promise. Not by the bloodline you're descended from and not by the works of the flesh, but by God's gracious work. The second comparison he makes, we can pull that one up, is Old Covenant versus New Covenant. Look at verses 24 and 25. He says, these women are two covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, he says, and that's Hagar. And then the other, Sarah, represents Jerusalem, who is the Jerusalem from above. And so what does he mean when he says two covenants? Well, the overarching framework of the Bible primarily focuses on two covenants. God makes a lot of covenants throughout the story of the Bible, but it really focuses on two. What we call the Old Covenant and what we call the New Covenant. The Old Covenant is the covenant of law, and that was given to Israel, Paul points out here, at Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus. When Israel came out of Egypt and they stood before Mount Sinai, Moses went up on the mountain and God gave them the law. And it was a covenant of law. And the covenant of law said, if you keep these commandments, you will live. If you break these commandments, you will die. And Paul says that Hagar represents the Old Covenant. Hagar's offspring are the product of what happens when you try to achieve salvation by physical efforts. That's the Old Covenant. But Sarah, he points out, she represents the New Covenant. The New Covenant inaugurated through Jesus' blood. Sarah's offspring are the results of what happens when we rely on God's power, when we trust God's faithfulness to keep his promises, just like Isaac was the result of God's good gift to Abraham apart from the works of his flesh. And so there's two covenants, the Old Covenant of law given through Moses and the New Covenant of grace given through Jesus Christ. Now, I want to clear up a misconception real quick, because when we talk about the covenant of law or the covenant of grace, we want to make sure that we don't wrongly assume there was no grace in the covenant of law, or that there's no law or commands in the covenant of grace. What do I mean by that? Well, God gave Israel this covenant of law, but he also showed them a whole lot of graciousness in the middle, didn't he? He gave them a whole lot of benefits and privileges they didn't deserve. And in the new covenant of grace, that doesn't mean there aren't commands that we're supposed to keep in obedience to Jesus Christ. So when we say law in grace, it doesn't mean that it was all law and God's grace was never involved, or that in the covenant of grace there's no commandments involved. What it's referring to is the way by which you obtain God's blessings. When we talk about law and grace, we're referring to the means by which covenant blessings are attained. The old covenant offered blessings if you could keep the law. The new covenant offers covenant blessings as a free gift to be received by grace alone, through faith alone, in Christ alone. So when we say the covenant of law, we mean the method by which you obtained God's blessings. And when we talk about the covenant of grace, we mean the method by which you obtain God's blessings. Under the covenant of law, nobody could obtain God's blessings because nobody could keep the law. Because of our sinful human nature, we are unable to keep all of its requirements. So a new covenant was needed. We read this in Jeremiah 31, and I'm going to ask you to turn there with me, back in your Old Testament to Jeremiah chapter 31. And look at verses 31 through 34. Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant that they broke, though I was their husband, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law within them, and I will write it on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And no longer shall each one teach his neighbor and each his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their iniquity, and I will remember their sin no more. What does the prophet Jeremiah say? God says, I gave them a covenant at Sinai when I brought them out of Egypt, but they broke the covenant. The problem wasn't the covenant. God's covenants are always good. The problem was the covenant members were incapable of keeping it. So God says, I will provide a new covenant, a covenant that will actually be able to achieve their salvation. Again, the problem was not the covenant. The problem was not God himself. The problem was that the covenant members couldn't keep its standards because of sin. So God would deal with that problem of sin to enable them to receive blessings. And in what way is this new covenant different? I think Jeremiah 31 points out three ways in which this new covenant will be different than the old. The first is he says, I will write my law within them. The law will not just be an external command carved on tablets of stone, but it will be the work of the Spirit in their hearts. When we get to the back end of Galatians, we'll see that God still calls his people to holy conduct. The difference is we're now filled with the Spirit. And so it's not just this external rule we're trying to adhere to. We've got the living, dynamic power of the Spirit of God within us. The law is at work in our hearts, carving away the old man, carving away the old woman, giving us new desires and new abilities to obey God from the heart. So this new covenant will be superior to the old in that regard. Secondly, notice he says, no one will say to his neighbor, know the Lord, because they will all know me. In other words, every member of this new covenant will know the Lord. Knowing God, having this relationship with God, will be a criteria for membership in this covenant community. Now, under the old covenant, under the law with Moses, there were tons of people who were part of the covenant community simply because they were Abraham's offspring, or simply because they had received circumcision. They didn't have a relationship with the Lord. They followed all the externals and they went through all the rituals, but they didn't actually have a real relationship with God. And he's saying that this new covenant is superior because all of the true covenant members will know the Lord. That's how you are a covenant member. You only are admitted into this covenant membership by knowing the Lord. So you've got the law written within you. You all know the Lord. And then lastly, he says in verse 34, I will forgive their iniquity. Their sins will be dealt with. All of the law breaking they committed under the first covenant will be forgiven. The old covenant could only produce condemnation. The more they tried to obey it, the more they kept disobeying and the more condemnation they would earn. The old covenant couldn't bring forgiveness for sin. It could only bring more condemnation. So this new covenant would produce forgiveness of sin. Well, how did that happen? How did all these things come about? Jesus told us when he instituted the Lord's Supper in Luke chapter 22, verse 20. As he gave the bread and he passed around the cup and he said, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. That new covenant that Jeremiah talked about hundreds of years ago, I'm inaugurating it right now. Through Christ's blood, through dying on the cross for his people, Jesus would inaugurate this effective way. And here's why. Here's why Jesus' death is so important for reconciling these two covenants. Because sometimes we think, okay, God gave the old covenant, that was plan A, didn't work out so well, so God had to kind of lower the bar, come up with something a little bit easier, right? People couldn't achieve that, so God made it real easy and said, okay, well, just have faith. That'll be enough. Well, that's not the relationship at all. It's not like God made the first covenant, changed his mind, walked it back, and then gave them a new one instead. We have the covenant of grace because Jesus fulfilled the covenant of law for us. The reason why we have a new covenant is because Jesus fulfilled the requirements of the old covenant. God didn't excuse his holy standard and say, all right, well, you know what, just never mind that old covenant. Jesus comes and fulfills every requirement of the covenant of law as our substitute. So now we can receive all of its benefits freely, and that is grace. That's why it's the new covenant of grace. Justification before the Lord is made fully available by grace alone because of the works of Jesus. Did you know that you and I are saved by the works of the law? Just not ours, but the works of Jesus, by keeping the law for us and suffering the penalties of the law on the cross. And so he's saying that these two women are sort of symbolic of these old and new covenants. The old covenant, Hagar and Ishmael, remember, that's the product of human fleshly attempts, whereas the new covenant is all of grace. Remember, Ishmael was the product of Abraham trying to achieve. That's like the law. But Isaac is the product of receiving from God. It is God's gift, graciously given, just like the salvation that you and I have because of Jesus. So this would have been shocking to the Judaizers who would have heard this, because their whole claim and their whole pride is, yeah, we're children of Isaac. And Paul says, no, you're more like Ishmael. And they would have had to look again, how dare he, because they put all this stock in being Isaac's sons. And he's like, no, you're trying to earn God's favor and God's promises by means of the flesh. That makes you no better than Hagar and Ishmael. But rather, the new covenant comes through the gracious gift given, just like Isaac. All right, the third contrast he makes here, the third one we can pull up, present-day Jerusalem versus heavenly Jerusalem. Let's look back in Galatians chapter 4, and we see in verses 25 through 26. He says Hagar is this old covenant, Mount Sinai, and he says she corresponds to the present Jerusalem. Whereas Sarah, he says in verse 26, is the Jerusalem that is above, and she is our mother. One of the timeless kids' books that all three of, and hopefully now four of my kids love, is this classic book called Are You My Mother? And it's a story of this little bird who falls out of his nest. His mom is off hunting for food, and he falls out of the nest, and he kind of hops and squeaks around, and he confronts all these other objects and animals, a cow, a dog, a crane, and he keeps asking, are you my mother? Are you my mother? And none of them are. And he keeps saying, I must have a mother. I must have come from somewhere. And then finally, at the end of the story, the sweet little baby bird is reconciled with his mother. Well, Paul is sort of asking the question here, who is your mother? You've got two options. Either the heavenly Jerusalem or the earthly one. Now, in the Old Testament, this is pretty interesting. In the Old Testament, the prophets often spoke of Jerusalem as though it were a woman. In the Old Testament, the prophets very often referred to Jerusalem as she. In fact, in places like Isaiah 66, verses 10 and 11, Jerusalem is actually compared to a mother, and the inhabitants of the city are compared to the children being nursed by the mother's side. And this analogy of a city being like a mother, it kind of makes sense if you think about it. A city is where you're from, kind of like how a baby is born from the mother. A city is where you live. It's where you receive your nourishment and your livelihood, just like a nursing baby upon its mother. And so he's saying here that which city you belong to is kind of like what mother you belong to, and which mother you belong to determines your status. Who is Ishmael's mother? Hagar, the slave woman. So who is Ishmael? He's no more than a slave. But who is Isaac's mother? Sarah, Abraham's wife and the free woman, the mistress of the household. So what does that make Isaac? The son born into freedom. And so Paul says, just like there's two, in this story of two sons, there's two mothers. And Paul says, just like there's two mothers, there's two cities at work here. There's two Jerusalems. Which Jerusalem you belong to determines your status. There's the physical Jerusalem that's in the Middle East. You can find it on a map. You can go visit it there today. This Jerusalem was the capital of Israel where King David and King Solomon reigned. It's where the temple was. The Jerusalem in the Middle East was the central functioning location of the Old Covenant. The Old Covenant given under Moses, the central hub of that covenant's operation was Jerusalem, because that's where the temple was, and that's where all the ceremonial rituals of the law were carried out. He calls this present Jerusalem in verse 25. But he says this earthly Jerusalem was just a picture of a greater Jerusalem, a bigger, grander, heavenly, eternal Jerusalem. And he says that Jerusalem that's in heaven, that is the blessed eternal city of the new covenant. The members of the old covenant dwelled in the earthly Jerusalem. But the members of the new covenant, their home, their mother is found in heaven. This is what he calls in verse 26, the Jerusalem from above. And this is the place that Jesus said he would go to prepare for us. Remember before he ascended and he said, I will go and prepare a place for you? That's the new Jerusalem. And Paul isn't the only New Testament author to use this language of the heavenly Jerusalem from above. The author of Hebrews in Hebrews 12 says, you have come to the Mount Zion, the city of the living God, the heavenly Jerusalem. John wrote in Revelation 21 verse 2, I saw a holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And so Paul's point here is if the mother you're trying to get nourishment from is nothing more than earthly and ritualistic, you're keeping yourself a slave. Remember, your mother determines your status. If you have bound yourself to the mother of earthly Jerusalem and the old covenant and all the rituals there, if you are trying to get fed from the milk of legalism, he said you are keeping yourself enslaved. But if your mother, if your source of belonging and sustenance in food is the eternal city that Jesus is preparing for his people, he says, then you're free. So that's the third contrast. Look at the fourth one. The fourth contrast is between fruitfulness and barrenness. In verse 27, he quotes from Isaiah chapter 54, verse 1, and he encourages the barren one who does not bear to cry aloud in joy, really. Why would the barren one cry aloud with hope? Because he says the children of the desolate one will be no more, or will be more than those of the one who has a husband. So in this kind of scenario, you've got a woman who has a child who's thinking, yeah, I'm the top mama around here because I've got a child. And then you've got this barren mother who yearns and longs for offspring. And she weeps because she's barren. And there's this hope given. You can cry out for joy because God will actually multiply your children more than the other woman. And this was the case with Sarah and Hagar. Hagar had a son, and we read in Genesis 16, she began to have contempt for Sarah. She began to sort of taunt Sarah and look down on Sarah because, like, nah, I've got a son and you don't. But the whole hope was that the son, the offspring, even the line of the Messiah would come from Sarah, not from Hagar. Now, I want to draw important attention to the context which this is from. This is from Isaiah chapter 54. And we don't have a whole lot of time. We've got to wrap up soon, but I really want us to look at this context because I think it'll add a whole new meaning to the way we see this. Look back in Isaiah chapter 54. Isaiah chapter 54, I want us to see some context here. The context of God saying this is that Israel at the time was being faced with impending punishment and exile for their sins. Israel had failed to keep that old covenant of the law. They were now being faced with the prospect of exile. Their children would be taken. They would be scattered all around the world. The result would be barrenness. The children of Israel would be no more. They would be scattered and lost. And so the whole question raised here is, does that mean God's promises to have children for himself would fail? Like Sarah, Israel perhaps feels barren. They see all these other nations prospering and growing, and now they're faced with exile and possibly extinction. And so they're wondering, will God's promises ever come to pass? And the promise of Isaiah 54 is that, no, someday the people of God would be greater than the nations of the world. Isaiah 54, sing, O barren one who did not bear. Break forth into singing and cry aloud, you who have not been in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than the children of her who is married, says the Lord. Enlarge the place of your tent. Let the curtains of your habitations be stretched out and do not hold back. Lengthen your cords and strengthen your stakes. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your offspring will possess the nations and will people the desolate cities. So what is he saying here? In verse 1, he's saying that God's people felt kind of like Sarah. Like, will we ever see this fruitful offspring that we're longing for? And he says, yes, but that offspring would not be limited to the nation of Israel. He says there in verse 3 that it would actually spread out and would include all the nations. This offspring would end up filling the entire world. And so the promise of God's people was not simply that there would be biological descendants from Abraham, but that all the nations would then be included in this. He's saying the fruitfulness I have planned for my people is bigger than you can even imagine. It would expand to the right and to the left. The property lines, the ropes that mark your property will be stretched out dramatically to the point that it's going to cover the entire world. The borders of God's family is someday going to include all nations. And the reason why Paul quotes this here is because he sees here a promise not just of Israel's expansion, but the growth of the worldwide church through all the nations. He's saying that through Jesus Christ, there will be a fruitful harvest of children for God. Not just those born of Abraham's lineage, but those who are sons of promise, like Isaac. And this is going to be worldwide. Now, the reason why I wanted to go to the context here is because look at the chapter right before that. What comes right before Isaiah chapter 54? Isaiah chapter 53. We all know Isaiah 53 because we hear it every single Easter. It's those famous passages about how He, God's servant, was pierced for our transgressions, right? How He was crushed for our iniquity, how the punishment that brought us peace was upon Him. By His wounds we are healed. God's people failed to keep the covenant, so this servant comes and suffers in their stead, takes their punishment instead. And by the end of Isaiah 53, He is resurrected and receives all acclaim and glory and honor. And now, as a result of Isaiah 53, you come to Isaiah 54. Now God's people will grow. Now sons and daughters can be brought in from every tribe and tongue because of the finished work of Jesus Christ. And so Paul is making that same point here, that the children of Abraham, the children that God promised, are those who are the recipients of what that suffering servant did in Isaiah chapter 53. Through Jesus, there is now a worldwide people, not of Abraham's blood, but by Christ's shed blood. Because Christ shed His blood in Isaiah 53, now people of all different bloodlines can now be included in the borders of God's kingdom. Well, let's go to our final contrast here, number 5. That between slavery and freedom. Galatians chapter 4 finishes by saying this. He says, just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, so also is it now. What is this talking about? Well, in Genesis chapter 21, verses 8 through 14, there was a story about how when Isaac was born, and he was just a wee little lad, he had just finally been weaned. So he's probably just a little toddler. And Ishmael, who is a teenager, basically a grown man at this point, comes along and starts taunting Isaac, starts making fun of Isaac, starts picking on him and being really rude to him. And so what ends up happening is Ishmael and Hagar end up getting sent out. Now that sounds a little cruel at first. We actually did cover that passage pretty thoroughly, so if you want to expound on that more, go watch that sermon. That's called Why Did Abraham Cast Out Hagar? In our Genesis series. It answers that a little more thoroughly. But again, allegorically, Paul takes this concept and says, what happened to Ishmael? What happened to the son of the flesh? He was cast out and had nothing, treated like a slave. What happened to the son of promise, the son born by the Spirit? What happened to the son who is the product of this new covenant inaugurated through Jesus? He is considered an heir. And so his point here, he closes the chapter by saying, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. He closes this chapter by saying, if you align yourself under Hagar, if you are trying to achieve right standing with God by the works of the flesh, by the covenant of law, he says it will only ever result in slavery. You will only ever be cast out because you keep breaking the covenant over and over again. The only way to liberty, the only way to freedom, the only way to be an heir is to be a child of grace, to be a recipient of God's promise, to be born again by the Holy Spirit, and that is it. And here's why. Here's a final analogy we can think of before the ushers bring the Lord's Supper. Think about a slave in shackles. Think about someone who's trapped, that they're tied down by these irons, and you are struggling with every effort you can to get out of these irons. Do you know what's going to happen? The more you push and pull and tug on these iron shackles around your wrist, do you know what's going to happen? The more you tug, the more you're going to tear up your arms. The worse it's going to get, the more pain is going to be inflicted, the more suffering is going to happen, and you will actually fall deeper into pain and entrapment. You can't get out that way. It's not your own struggle that's going to liberate you from slavery. Your only hope is for someone to come in with the key and set you free, for someone to liberate you from it. And so Paul says, when you try to earn God's favor through law, you are keeping yourself trapped in slavery. The only hope of delivery is God's grace in Jesus Christ. He who inaugurated the new covenant through his shed blood. That's the key to your release. That's the key to sonship. Receive his promise, church. I don't know where you are this morning. I don't know if in your mind you think of yourself as good enough. If you think, if I can just perform enough, if I can just do enough, God will notice me. I will then be, maybe like Abraham, you think I can take matters into my own hands and I can bring about God's promises through the work of my flesh. Paul says, don't even try it. The result is just continual slavery. The key is to receive what God has done for you in Jesus Christ. Receive the benefits of the new covenant because Jesus kept all the requirements of the law on your behalf. And when we do that, he says we are children of the Jerusalem that is above, of the free woman, and heirs of God through Christ.